So the French bishops were polled and asked questions about the Latin Mass in their own dioceses. Stick around to find out what they said. So we've all been hearing the rumors that Pope Francis may further restrict the Latin Mass within a diocesan context, not for the institutes, the FSSP, ICKSP, and so on, but just within a diocesan context. Now, these are just rumors, but people are just heavily speculating that this is going to happen. And it may or may not be true. I have done multiple videos on the likelihood of that and also whether or not this would be a good approach of Pope Francis. I've also done videos explaining why he might do this. And I think this video will help answer some of those questions. Because what happened was originally with Traditionis Custodes several years ago when Pope Francis initially put some restrictions on access to the Latin Mass, the Missal of 1962. Initially, at that time, there were a group of bishops, a large group of bishops throughout the world who were consulted on this question, and they sent Pope Francis their feedback. And so Pope Francis went ahead with restrictions on the Missal of 62, the Latin Mass. He went through with that decision based on the feedback that he got. Now, at the time, there was a lot of speculation on that feedback, whether or not it was authentic, whether or not he really did consult the bishops, and there was emerging from this situation a document that explained what the French bishop said to a survey by the Vatican, but it was in French and really got overlooked and was only just now translated into English. So we're going to take a look and see what the French bishops said, because it certainly relates to why Traditionis Custodes happened, and it will certainly have impact on perhaps potential further restrictions in the future. So let's take a look at this specifically. And we can answer the question, why might there be future restrictions on the Missal of 62, which is, again, still speculative. This is posted by Where Peter Is, French bishops on the traditional Latin Mass, Two Worlds That Do Not Meet. Again, just recently translated into English. So let me give you a preface here, or the preface written by Mike Lewis. When Pope Francis promulgated his July 2021 Motu Proprio Traditionis Custodes, which placed new restrictions on the celebration of the pre-Vatican II 62 Roman liturgy, he sent an accompanying letter to the bishops of the world explaining his reasons for doing so. In the letter, he refers to the results of a survey sent out to the bishops of the world, asking for their feedback regarding Pope Benedict's 2007 Motu Proprio, allowing wider access to what was then called the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, 13 years after its implementation. So Pope Francis wrote this to the bishops. I instructed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to circulate a questionnaire to the bishops regarding the implementation of the Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum. The responses reveal a situation that preoccupies and saddens me and persuades me of the need to intervene. Regrettably, the pastoral objective of my predecessors, who had intended to do everything possible to ensure that all those who truly possess the desire for unity would find it possible to remain in this unity or to rediscover it anew, has often been seriously disregarded. An opportunity offered by John Paul II and, with greater magnanimity, Benedict XVI, intended to recover the unity of an ecclesial body with diverse liturgical sensibilities, was exploited to widen the gaps, reinforce the divergences, and encourage disagreements that injure the church, block her path, and expose her to the peril of division. So, what Pope Francis is saying is the reason why there was this restriction on the Missal of 62, the Latin Mass, the reason why he is taking that decision at the time whenever he released Traditionis Custodes was because the provisions made by Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict were exploited, and the reverse of the intention is what ended up happening. And there was a weaponization of the liturgy that further caused divisions rather than unity. And that is what this survey is going to bring out to some degree as we look at their responses. So it says many traditionalists and their supporters immediately began to question the Pope's claims about the results of the survey, suggesting the fix was in from the beginning. So people were just saying, this wasn't a real survey. This was just all a setup just so that Pope Francis can ban the Latin Mass because he hates it. That was the claim was made at the time. Certainly not true, and the evidence now shows that that is not the case. Back in 2021, journalists Ines San Martin of Crux investigated the distribution of the survey, contacting around 20 bishops from the world. She provided the text of 9 bishops on the survey, as well as an overview of the process, which varied from country to country. The lack of concrete information coming from the Vatican has not prevented rumors from circulating or survey results from being leaked. Vatican journalist Diane Montega wrote a lengthy article in the traditionalist newspaper, The Remnant, in which she shared excerpts from the responses of individual bishops that she had obtained. She was concerned that the responses from certain countries, like Italy, were not so positive, saying she had reason to believe that some of the Italian bishops were coached in their responses. Still, she was much more positive about the results of other countries, writing in those regions where the traditional Mass is more widespread, like France. The CDF received a 65 to 75% response from these countries, and of that percentage, more than 50% were favorable. This would have been reflected in the main report. Her theory that the Pope's statement about the survey did not reflect the actual results had gained traction, and she appeared in the 3rd episode of Mass of the Ages trilogy to discuss it. Montega's theory, however, overlooks a major piece of evidence that contradicts her claims. Back in February 2021, before Traditionis Custodes was published, traditionalist bloggers obtained a copy of the synthesis of the French bishop's responses to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith survey, and they posted it on the web. Several traditionalist outlets criticized the document after it was leaked, but it has received little notice since, at least in English language media. I remember seeing it at the time, but because it was in French and the PDF was scanned at an angle with poor resolution, I never took the time to translate it. Neither did anyone else, apparently. But he has gone ahead and translated this and just posted it for us. So, France has the 2nd largest traditionalist presence in the world after the United States. He says it's reasonable, therefore, to suggest that this document had significant influence on Pope Francis's decision. All right, so let's see what the document says. Some general data. We have completed questionnaires from 87 of the 92 metropolitan dioceses. The contribution from the Diocese of Verdun, which was sent directly to Rome, could not be included in the summary. It gives a few dioceses that do not have feedback for the CDF. All right, so question 1. What is the situation in your diocese with respect to the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite? For dioceses, the application of the motu proprio is irrelevant, as there is no celebration according to the extraordinary form in them. In most dioceses, 1 or 2 venues are dedicated, at least in part, to celebration according to the extraordinary form. On average, they welcome fewer than 100 people. Most often, the place of celebration is a diocesan church or chapel where the ordinary form of the Roman Rite is also celebrated. Some dioceses have set up personal parishes or quasi parishes. Despite pressure, the Bishop of Nimes does not wish to set up such a personal parish. Not all dioceses specify who is in charge of the extraordinary form celebrations, but at least 24 dioceses use the FSSP, 18 use priests from their own diocese, and 16 dioceses call on the ICKSP. And it goes on. It should be noted that some dioceses are marked by significant tourism and organized celebrations according to the 62 Missal in places that welcome vacationers or in shrines during certain holidays. And it gives a few examples. So it gives a summary for question 1. And it says, in most dioceses, the situation seems to have calmed down. Some points of tension remain, often linked to history and long-standing conflicts. Relationships are highly dependent on the personalities of the priests entrusted with the task of ensuring celebrations according to the extraordinary form. The responses reveal that bishops desires to involve as many diocesan priests as possible in celebration in the extraordinary form, but this is proving difficult due to the small number of priests involved. Again, all of this in the survey, including other surveys to other countries, was factored in to Pope Francis's decisions with Traditionis Custodes. It continues, question 2. If the extraordinary form is practiced there, does it respond to a true pastoral need, or is it being promoted by a single priest? Well, it says several bishops question the very notion of pastoral need and of a stable group as formulated in the motu proprio. In almost 2/3 of the dioceses that responded, the bishop considers that the extraordinary form celebration proposal meets a genuine pastoral need. However, one statement regularly came up. The extraordinary form meets the expectations of a few rather than a pastoral need. When does the expectation of the faithful become a pastoral need? Many bishops stress that the significance of offering this form of celebration is to help the faithful maintain a link with the Catholic Church and thus prevent them from joining other communities or places served by priests of the Society of St. Pius X. However, when a place run by the SSPX is nearby, there is no noticeable flow back to the Catholic Church. Oh, that's interesting. No noticeable flow back to the Catholic Church when the SSPX is nearby. What's more, the situation often keeps the faithful in a particular understanding of the Church: rejection of the Council, the Second Vatican Council, criticism of Pope Francis, hostility to a Church that is too open. These masses are rarely promoted by priests, just a few individuals, but much more often by young families with many children. Several bishops also note that the extraordinary form celebrations can lead to ritual formalism. It often reinforces individualism and a sense of exclusivity. In the same vein, others question the theological formation of the priests of the Fraternity of St. Peter, or ICKSP. Finally, the attitudes of certain priests from these outside institutes sometimes hinders communion and fraternal life in the diocese. So it gives a summary of question 2, or the answer to question 2, and it says, from the bishop's responses, it is clear that the provision for masses according to the 62 Missal responds primarily to a concern for community in which the bishop acts out of pastoral sensitivity. This does not exclude occasional pressure from some ordinaries. So now we see question 3 here. In your opinion, what are the positive and negative aspects of using the extraordinary form? It says the aspects listed below are expressions used by the bishops. They are listed in order of importance or recurrence. Positive aspects: appeasement, fewer demands, satisfies the faithful, respects liturgical sensibility, a sense of the sacred, silence, promotes interiority and recollection, solemnity, promotes Eucharistic faith in the real presence, preserves spiritual and liturgical heritage, especially hymns, prevents some departures to the SSPX, balm for those wounded after the Second Vatican Council, Unity of the church is built around the Eucharist, openness to ecclesial communion, more explicit sacrificial dimension of the Mass, a form that could play a role in ecumenical dialogue with Eastern Christians. We still await mutual enrichment. Celebrating ad orientem can be an antidote to the risk of clericalism. Better acquaintance, better diocesan priests, and those from institutes celebrating according to the extraordinary form. Some priests say that the extraordinary form helps them to be more attentive to the mysteries celebrated. So most of these we've heard as positives. This seems pretty common. So some negative aspects that they noted: wounds church unity, resistance to Vatican II, a resistance mentality, communities highly critical of the conciliar church, two churches, liturgical sensitivities take precedence over ecclesial communion, the Eucharist that should unite what is separated, introduces a parallel church, creates two worlds that have difficulty understanding each other. The motu proprio introduced de facto by ritualism in the Roman Rite. Closed group, isolation, withdrawal, community apart, subjectivism and individualism. FSSP priests refuse concelebration, even at the Chrism Mass, contrary to Pope Benedict XVI's letter that says, needless to say, in order to experience full communion, the priests of the communities adhering to the former usage cannot, as a matter of principle, exclude celebrating according to the new books. The total exclusion of the new rite would not, in fact, be consistent with the recognition of its value and holiness. So Benedict said, the Novus Ordo is valuable and holy, and you can't just outright, a matter of principle, refuse to celebrate it, even for the institutes that have a charism of preserving the Latin Mass. And they're expressing concern that some FSSP priests refuse concelebration, a point that we have seen before. No participation in diocesan life. Difficulty involving them in diocesan activities. Catholics on the margins of the diocese. Little involvement in diocesan life. No coordination of information with the diocese. Experiencing separation from the heart of diocesan unity. The challenges of using a different liturgical calendar and lectionary. Harmonizing the sanctoral cycle. The calendar, was it fixed before the council? Why should it be after? Limited exposure to the Word of God. Nurtures a lack of understanding and a blurring of the lines between the different forms of the Roman Rite. These faithful are deprived of a liturgical richness linked to the Reform. No passage between the two forms of the single rite that could be expected. Weakens the community dimension of the celebration. Little mention of the Holy Spirit. Unfortunate introduction of rites from one form into the other. Difficult to enrich each other. Tension over sacramental ministry. Difficulties for catechesis, different paths. Favors liturgical tourism. Reading a bilingual missal doesn't foster a union of hearts. Liturgical form remains hermetic. The extraordinary form faithful are marked by a singular worldview and political outlook. Poor preaching. The difficulty of entrusting a mission elsewhere to priests who have become specialists in the extraordinary form. Communities lobbying for what they want. Risk of identifying the extraordinary form Mass with the only true Mass. These are all things that Pope Francis was sent by bishops, concerns that were being expressed. So all of this weighed in. They all factored in whenever Pope Francis released Traditionis Custodes. Lacking in missionary dimension. Many priests who celebrate exclusively according to the extraordinary form believe that the ordinary form Mass is illegitimate. Some institute priests celebrating according to the extraordinary form feel they are under the orders of the faithful who supervise them, functionally Protestant. Impossibility of organizing common prayer times, vespers or adoration. Liturgical training of these communities is ritual rather than theological. Lack of development of theological virtues, ritual becomes charity. Difficulty in manifesting the unity of the Roman Rite suggests that liturgy is a matter of personal taste. The bishop's authority over these communities is virtually non-existent. All this was factored in to Traditionis Custodes. All of this is the feedback from the bishops. And this is what is being referred to in part whenever Pope Francis and others speak of a weaponization of the liturgy. This is what we're talking about. So here's a summary. While two bishops did not see any positive aspects, which I would say that's hard to believe, really, that no positive aspects of the Missal of 62. Seriously? While two bishops did not see any positive aspects, almost all agree that the application of the motu proprio has had a calming effect. One might wonder if this calm is entirely good news. It was hoped that a dialogue would open on genuine adherence to conciliar teaching. Although the motu proprio has undeniably fostered calm, it has not necessarily increased communion, notes one bishop. That's an important point. The calm seems to have somewhat frozen the state of relations, and the dialogue has suffered as a result. I think there's some truth to what that bishop was saying. There's definitely some truth to that. Bishops question the real communion of these faithful with the Catholic Church. A division seems to have solidified. The main difficulties faced by the bishops include diocesan communion, the use of different liturgical calendars and lectionaries, and the refusal to concelebrate, which is a massive problem. If there's a refusal to concelebrate, we can't say that we're part of the same church. It's impossible. If we can't concelebrate, our clergy can't concelebrate, okay, that's not communion. That's not full communion. So that is an impairment and a rupture in communion when that happens. Question 4. Are the norms and conditions laid down in Summorum Pontificum respected? So here's what they say. Bishops say they are often only indirectly aware that the norms of the motu proprio are being respected. However, most feel that these norms are respected. Several bishops, however, ask what the motu proprio designates as a stable group. It is clear that in many places where the extraordinary form is celebrated, a center of attraction is created for faithful coming from far away, sometimes from other dioceses. A dozen or so bishops also note that while the letter of the motu proprio seems to have been respected, the same cannot be said of its spirit. Adherence is formal, but this does not prevent us from questioning the sometimes critical, even suspicious stance of these communities towards the conciliar church beyond the liturgy. The preaching can reveal this drift. Here again, some bishops have pointed out that Benedict XVI did not want priests to celebrate exclusively in the extraordinary form. Yet, as we have already noted, FSSP priests do not depart from the exclusive use of this form. Finally, links with the bishop are not without issues. Some are not informed of decisions, establishing schools, special celebrations, and are even less involved in confirmations. This sometimes raises the question of obedience in the face of episcopal decisions. There's a specific comment on the SSPX. Archbishop of Rennes, for marriage according to the letter of the Ecclesia Dei Commission of April 4th, 2017, the local ordinary can ask a priest to celebrate it according to the liturgical tradition prior to Vatican Council II. However, the Society of St. Pius X categorically refused the priest I sent. Furthermore, It seems that the priests of the Society of St. Pius X have the newlyweds sign a document in which they promise not to go before the diocesan tribunal in the event of a request for the recognition of a nullity of the marriage. So they're being required by the SSPX to sign a document saying we won't seek an annulment. If we need to seek an annulment, we're not going to do it through the bishop of the diocese. So that's a parallel institution. That's a parallel church. This is one example among many where the SSPX is a parallel church. The issue is absent from the motu proprio, it says. Summary. While the norms of the motu proprio seem to have been respected by the majority, questions remain as to the respect of its spirit. Clarification of the note of a stable group and the non-exclusivity of the extraordinary form would be beneficial. Okay, question number 5. Do you know whether the ordinary form has adopted elements of the extraordinary form in your diocese? For almost all the bishops who have answered this question, there have been no adaptation or adoption of elements of the extraordinary form, which is tragic. The two forms need to mutually enrich each other. We note a few minor elements. So they do give a few examples, a few minor elements. Greater use of Latin in ordinary and hymns in general. Older ornaments of use of the liturgical color black. Additional signs of the cross, veiled statues during Passiontide, blessing of the water cruet, bells, communion tray. All good things, wonderful things to mutually enrich the ordinary form. On a positive note, a dozen bishops have noted a greater rigor and care in celebrating the ordinary form by a good number of young priests, greater fidelity to the rubrics. But the bishops wonder whether this is a more question of generation than of the influence of the extraordinary form. Legitimate question. Summary. The overall observation is that we are witnessing two worlds that do not meet. No mutual enrichment. When elements are introduced in the ordinary form, they are more a source of tension than enrichment. Often extraordinary means exclusive. Several bishops regret that the question was asked in one direction only. What about enrichment of the extraordinary form by the ordinary form? Question 6. For the celebration of Mass, is the missal promulgated by by Pope John the 23rd in 1962 used? Is the missal of 62 being used? In the vast majority of cases, this missal is for celebrations in the extraordinary form. Is used for celebrations in the extraordinary form. So in the majority of cases, they're using the Missal of 62. In some dioceses, other missals, sometimes older, like maybe the 55 Missal, may be used, or prayers, rites, or deviations may be added. The Diocese of Valence declares that it is not the 1962 Missal that is used without specifying which one. In Versailles, the bishop urges that the 64 to 65 be taken into account. That's interesting. The Bishop of Nimes points out that it is difficult to know whether the Good Friday prayer for the Jews is actually done according to the form modified by Benedict XVI. A summary. Although the bishops acknowledge that they have not verified the use of the Missal in all places, which is, to me, just, what? So they're just not really paying attention that much. It does not seem that the 62 Missal is used. It does seem that the 62 Missal is used most of the time. A few exceptions to this norm have been noted without creating any particular difficulties. I'm getting the impression that the bishops have just kind of let them do their own thing and they're not hands-on and they're not paying attention. And that could be one of the problems. That could be one of the reasons why there is a weaponization of this. Maybe if the bishops were more interactive, were more hands-on, they could ensure that there isn't a weaponization among these communities. Maybe. Question 7. Apart from the celebration of Mass in the extraordinary form, are there any other celebrations like baptism, confirmation, marriage, and so on? According to the pre-Vatican II liturgical books, in most dioceses where Mass is celebrated in the extraordinary form, the other sacraments are also celebrated. Only 5 bishops declare that there are no other celebrations. Catechumens do not always take part in the rite of election and do not benefit from the scrutinies. Bishops celebrate confirmations regularly, every 1 or 2 years. In some dioceses, communities are reluctant to appeal to the local ordinary. A recurring question is what catechesis is available to those preparing for the sacraments? These catechetical programs are often far removed from diocesan standards. We note that bishops are vigilant in having acts transcribed into parish registers. The celebration of weddings, funerals, baptisms, and the anointing of the sick, in accordance with the ancient rite, are punctual and exceptional. Occasionally, the ritual is adapted slightly. For Easter, the bishops are not always informed of what is celebrated, and there is no general rule for French dioceses. One point of attention concerns Holy Thursday. It's not always easy to prevent 2 celebrations. Rare are the dioceses where the bishop is called upon for ordinations. Only the bishop of Frejus Toulon celebrates the ordination in the extraordinary form every year. Summary. Where a community is established, it virtually always celebrates the full range of sacraments. Question 8. Has the motu proprio summorum pontificum had any influence on the life of seminaries, particularly yours, and houses of formations? It says bishops sending seminarians to the seminaries of a whole long list here say that they have not observed any particular influence of the motu proprio on seminary life. In Bayonne, 1 Mass a week is celebrated according to the extraordinary form. It's optional. 1 Mass a week is celebrated in the ordinary form in Latin and is compulsory. In Toulon, 1 Mass a month is celebrated in the extraordinary form. In Versailles, seminarians attend Mass in the extraordinary form several times a year. Community of St. Martin Seminary does not celebrate Mass in the extraordinary form. Some bishops had noted that seminarians from certain areas have left these places of formation and joined the FSSP. Several bishops stress the importance of training and liturgical understanding in seminaries. This should lead to a proper understanding of the ordinary form of the Roman Rite. Seminarians should not be led to believe that there are 2 forms to choose from in the Latin Church. A pedagogy is to be developed so the presentation of the extraordinary form is made in a non-segregating manner. Sometimes seminarians form themselves through their own network or by spending time in religious communities which celebrate the extraordinary form. Others take advantage of their time off to familiarize themselves with the extraordinary form. One bishop suggests that we consider training some seminarians to celebrate according to the extraordinary form in order to free ourselves from dependence on particular institutes, notably the FSSP, which celebrates exclusively according to the extraordinary form. A general comment is that seminarians have a poor command of Latin. One bishop is surprised that the ICKSP organized a trip with young people under 18 to Griciliano for ordinations. Summary. The motu proprio's influence on seminary life is weak. On the other hand, its impact on seminarians is not entirely negligible. Bishops are attentive to the training provided in their seminaries, or those on which they depend, and exercise vigilance over the way in which seminarians live out their attachment to the liturgy. So, question 9. The 13 years after the motu proprio summorum pontificum, what advice would you give on the subject of the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite? On this question, to which the bishops gave a wide-ranging response, we can identify recurring elements grouped here by a major theme. Unity of diocesan life. Encourage the faithful who use the extraordinary form to participate more fully in diocesan life. Bishops are keen to encourage the extraordinary form faithful to participate with other diocesans in the Chrism Mass, ordination, and diocesan pilgrimages. The distinctiveness and exclusivity of the celebration of the extraordinary form by certain communities undermines the unity of the diocesan presbyterate and limits the service of these priests in the dioceses to the celebration of the extraordinary form. This undermines the diocesan impetus for unity and peace. A parallel pastoral approach can be implemented insidiously. Some bishops have noted that communities often make demands and that the motu proprio has only served to reinforce a small minority and their shortcomings and the cultivation of their particularisms by demanding more rights. A world apart, a parallel church is taking shape. Whoa, whoa. I bet that hit Pope Francis like a ton of bricks. This is the feedback he is getting and was getting from bishops. A world apart, a parallel church is taking shape. Wow. Wow. I hate to say it, but that's true. Not in all cases, but yeah, in a certainly considerable amount of cases, that's true. And that's so sad because it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be. There's nothing wrong with the Missal of 62 that it would create a parallel church. Not at all. Not at all. Yes, some things needed to be reformed liturgically, some things needed to be restored, but in and of itself, it's not causing a parallel church. It's rather people weaponizing it, causing a parallel church. That's heartbreaking to read because that's a good and holy liturgy being weaponized. Liturgical calendar and lectionary. Share the same liturgical calendar and lectionary. Virtually all bishops stress the importance of having the same lectionary. This would be a significant mark of the enrichment of the extraordinary form by the ordinary form. Yes. Yes. Agreed. Highlighting the Word of God. Opening up the treasure trove of the Word of God in this way would also enable FSSP and ICKSP priests to enter into an understanding of liturgical teaching stemming from the Reform, but also from Verbum Domini or Evangelii Gaudium. Exclusivity of celebration according to the 62 Missal. Reversing the exclusive use of the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. The FSSP's exclusive use of the extraordinary form poses a problem for diocesan life and is contrary to the motu proprio. It is a cause for scandal. It should not be possible for some within the Catholic Church to deem it impossible to celebrate the present Mass, sometimes going so far as to claim a proper charism. One bishop suggests that a priest who refuses to celebrate in the ordinary form should not be incarnated. In addition, as already mentioned, the training of a few diocesan priests in the extraordinary form could make it possible to respond to various requests without calling on other institutes and also contribute to diocesan unity. It continues. It says, doctrinal concern. So there's some doctrinal concerns here. What are they? Well, nurturing the communion of faith within the church. The challenge is to maintain and nurture the full communion of certain communities with the Catholic Church. Indeed, many of the communities celebrating the extraordinary form make no secret of their criticism or even distrust of the Second Vatican Council and its orientations. There is an ecclesiological question underlining the application of the motu proprio. We must not forget the Church's moral teaching until we forget Amor Laetitia. In other words, some of this community will appeal to the Church's moral teaching up until a certain point, and that's it. And then they'll ignore the rest of the magisterium on the moral teachings of the Church. And then some, again, are ignoring the Second Vatican Council and the need to reform the liturgy. This is probably one of the biggest problems of catechesis that we lack today. Why was the liturgy reformed? People need to be catechized properly and know there were good reasons to reform the liturgy. Now, whether that has been successful is a different question. But the reforms that Vatican II called for are legitimate and were needed. And people need to be better catechized there. Missionary dynamism. Remedy the weakness of the missionary dynamism of ecclesial communities celebrating the extraordinary form. For many members of the extraordinary form, Christian life boils down to Sunday practice with no further spiritual or theological training. This is a far cry from Pope Francis's concept of missionary discipleship. It is important to make priests of Ecclesia Dei institutes more sensitive to the needs of God's people than to questions of personal sensitivity. One way of doing this would be to invite priests to work on the link between the Eucharist and the apostolic life in the service of a section of the people of God. The FSSP could also extend its zeal beyond communities celebrating in the ordinary form. Points for consideration. Be careful not to extend the extraordinary form so as not to induce a misunderstanding of the place of this form, which could come to be seen as a rite. Young people with fragile self-identity are easily fascinated by the extraordinary form. They are encouraged in their obsidious fever by mediocre preaching and social networks that impoverish reflection on liturgical formation, history, and theology, reinforcing each young person's ideology and even excesses. Yeah, I can see that in some cases. Ecclesiology. Ensure the obedience of communities celebrating the extraordinary form. During the March 2020 ad limina visit, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith referred this question to the Congregation for Divine Worship, which in turn referred it to the CDF. Questions. Should we promote the coexistence of both forms in the same parish as opposed to erecting personal parishes? What attention and vigilance can we bring to the formation given in institutes such as ICKSP, FSSP? Why is there such a craze, particularly among young people, for the extraordinary form, the scrupulous form? Summary. The bishops overwhelmingly support the principle of a unified celebration, the use of the lectionary, the same liturgical calendar, and adherence to the current magisterium. Those are good suggestions. Those are good calls. The publication of the motu proprio had a laudable intention, but it did not bear the expected fruit. This is the feedback that was sent to Pope Francis by bishops when he made his decision to implement some restrictions on the Latin Mass. Although it honors a principle of reality, unrelenting work to achieve unity continues to be necessary. Promises of mutual enrichment between the two forms of the single Roman Rite remain largely unfulfilled. And that's certainly true. That's certainly true. Rigid mistrust continues. Rigid mutual mistrust. The implementation of the motu proprio has failed to deliver on its vision for unity in the church. Ultimately, the practical implementation of the motu proprio raises challenges that are more ecclesiological than liturgical. So there's some issues here that pertain to ecclesiology and challenges that pertain to ecclesiology more than liturgy. So there it is. This is the feedback that was sent to the Pope from one group of bishops, the bishops of France. Now, it's not hard to imagine that's likely the feedback they received from other nations as well. This is the second largest nation that provides for the extraordinary form, second only to the United States. I suspect the same feedback was sent from the United States. And so if you're the Pope and you're asking, hey, how's this going with Summorum Pontificum? And this is the feedback that you're getting. A parallel church is effectively being established. There is a failure to mutually enrich these two forms. There is a certain sectarianism going on. There's refusal to concelebrate. There is a weaponizing of this liturgy. The intention was noble, but it's just not happening. That obviously factored in to Pope Francis's decision with Traditionis Custodes. He tells us that's what factored in. He expressed all those things in Traditionis Custodes and also the accompanying letter and explained this is why he was taking the step that he took. So rather than bring about what Pope Benedict was hoping for, people often, not always, but often weaponized this opportunity instead of using the opportunity properly. That's tragic because I really do think these two forms can mutually enrich each other. And it's horrible that that was the outcome. And honestly, since Traditionis Custodes, can you honestly say that the situation has improved? I think these problems have just been exacerbated more and more. And not necessarily because of Traditionis Custodes, but because of the people reacting to it who prefer the Missal of 62. Rather than prove Pope Francis wrong, many of them, not all, but many, especially the ones that have the most influence, have proved Pope Francis and these bishops right. They had such a good opportunity with Summorum Pontificum. Dropped the ball there, failed there. When Traditionis Custodes came out, this group, by and large, really dropped the ball and further reinforced these concerns rather than proving Pope Francis wrong. They had an opportunity to reverse this with Traditionis Custodes. They doubled down and made things way worse in many cases. Not everybody, but again, the most noteworthy groups and those who have influence in this community and those who have a head on their shoulders and prefer the Missal of 62, but are completely faithful to the magisterium, they have not spoken up in the way that the others have. They have not. They've been MIA. So while I recognize there's a group of really good people who love the Missal of 62, I love the Missal of 62, but a group of people who really love the Missal of 62 and go to liturgies celebrating this, and they're faithful, they're not weaponizing it, while they're certainly there, they failed to speak up over and against others in their community who weaponized this liturgy. And so, if we do see further restrictions, I think at this point, this community has themselves to blame because the good people didn't speak up and the bad people continued to do what they were doing. Now, whether or not this is still the best way to handle the situation on part of Pope Francis, further restricting it, not so sure. I'm not so sure that's the best way to handle this. I did a whole show talking about that, but yeah, I'm not so sure that would be better. But you know what? I could totally understand why Pope Francis might further restrict its accessibility within a diocesan context. I could totally understand why, even though I might not think this is the best approach. I can't say that I don't get it. We don't know if a document is coming out for sure. There's rumors, but we don't know for sure. Is it too late? I don't think it's too late. I do think that if there are people out there who love the Missal of 62 and they want to see it continue to be celebrated in full communion without being weaponized, they need to speak up. This is their time to shine. They need to speak up. And you know what? I'm here to support you. You'll always have an advocate with me. I will support you. And I call on other people in this community who, again, have a head on their shoulders. You know, they're not weaponizing the liturgy. They have a good understanding of the situation, of the magisterium, fidelity to the church, but love the Missal of 62. I want to see them speak up over and against the dissenters, over and against those who weaponize this liturgy, over and against those who say, I will break communion with Pope Francis just to preserve this liturgy. I want to see them speak up over and against that community, because right now they're being drowned out by the dissenters who have weaponized this good and holy liturgy. This is their time to shine. This is their time to speak up before further restrictions come, because sooner or later they're going to come. Should they come right now? It's a different question. Ultimately, the Roman Rite, it does appear there should be one form. Is this the best way to bring that about? Further restricting it? Again, debatable. But if you think no, and I think that right now we could still benefit from having more accessibility to the Missal of 62, now is your time to speak up. Stop letting the dissenters drown you out with their voices as content creators all over YouTube and all over Twitter. Stop letting them establish the narrative. Let Pope Francis hear from you if you're a good and faithful Catholic who prefers the Missal of 62. Now's your time to shine. And if you don't do that, do not complain if you see more restrictions of the Missal of 62. Don't complain. Don't complain. Everybody hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Check me out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. If you appreciate this show, you appreciate this channel, if you think I'm doing good work, and if you want to see more content like this, check me out there, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, and share this with your friends. Of course, again, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. All right, God bless.
Hey friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com.